Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this brilliant afternoon's conversation. My name's Louise Rowland, and I'm Deputy Chief Executive of UFI, and I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome to the people who are joining us online, as well as the people who are here at RSA House. Before we start, I've got some very important housekeeping notes. I will be testing you on them at the end. Smoking or vaping, you're not allowed to do it in RSA House. However, you can do it on Durham House Street entrance, which I believe is out there. I'll see you there later. The fire alarm, there's none scheduled, so if it does sound off, then please do follow RSA staff. Gather on the corner of John Adams Street and Robert Street, which is right next to the Adelphi building. Hopefully you've all got that. Follow a member of staff. So the event is being recorded, and it's also being live streamed. And questions from the audience and also from our online guests, please, we're looking forward to having lots of them. Save them to the end of the session, and you'll be invited to ask them. And if you're online, then I think there's instructions online for what you need to do. So, I'm really pleased that you've been able to join us for this really special event in our week of VocTech, where we can really have a chance to think about how we create the skills system that meets the needs of our transitioning UK economy. For us at UFI, that means a system that gives everyone the opportunity to get the skills they need for work. Before I introduce the speakers, I wanted to explain why here RSA House is a really good place for us to be having this conversation. So since the 1840s, the RSA has been campaigning for systems-wide reforms and also holding exhibitions in many areas, including the first public examinations and workers' self-education. So building on these deep roots in the RSA, we've been working together for about 5 years to unite people and places and ideas to show how tech can help tackle the UK skills crisis. So being here today, campaigning for systems change, and later on downstairs showcasing some of the brilliant work that UFI has funded feels like a really, really good fit. So why this topic? At UFI, our mission is to create a world where vocational skills are really celebrated and valued as the engine upon which our economy is built, and where the development of those skills is made possible by the best technology solutions. And that's about providing greater access, greater opportunity, and better outcomes for all. However, our research shows that this ambition cannot be realised without a new vision for the UK skills system. The current skill system is no longer fit for purpose, and it's unable to meet the demands of our ever-changing economy. Over the last 15 years, economic growth has been erratic, productivity growth has flatlined. Adult participation in learning has generally declined, particularly in those groups of communities and people who haven't done well or got lots of formal skills and qualifications. Government and employer investment in adult training is also falling. We know that economic growth comes from a better skilled workforce, and that must include every part of the workforce. So this means ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to develop skills for work throughout their lives. Building a future economy and a labour market where people aren't just playing catch-up, but they have the chance to thrive in new industries and sectors. And we believe that equitable growth will require new skills strategies, and that technology has a crucial role to play in opening up access and opportunity. But we worry that current thinking on the UK skills system isn't bold enough or ambitious enough to meet the UK's ambitions for a thriving, sustainable economy. And therefore, it couldn't be more important to be having that discussion today. So I'm really delighted to introduce our panellists, Torsten Bell, Rebecca Garrod-Waters and Stephen Evans, representing organisations who are at the forefront of working out exactly how we can get the skills we need to achieve our shared ambitions for social and economic change. Torsten has been Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation since 2015, is that right?
Ages.
For those of you who don't know, the Resolution Foundation is an independent think tank focused on improving living standards for those on low to medium incomes. Prior to this, Torsten worked in HM Treasury, boo hiss, oh no, joking, and as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors during the financial crisis. Torsten was also Director of Policy at the Labour Party. Stephen has been Chief Executive of Learning and Work Institute since 2016. Learning and Work's an independent policy, research and development organisation dedicated to lifelong learning, full employment and inclusion. Previously, Stephen worked for Working Links, the London Development Agency, the Social Market Foundation and in the Treasury. Rebecca?
No boo hiss there.
You get booed.
He's behind you. Rebecca is the CEO of Ufi VocTech Trust, and I'll hand over to Rebecca to get the conversation started.
Thank you, Louise. And I'm just going to add my welcome to everyone in the room and everyone online. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion we're about to have. We've talked a little bit about where we're all in enthusiastic agreement and also where those points of tension are. So hopefully it will be a good discussion, but I also really want everyone to think about, to use the opportunity to ask questions, and we'll pick those up at the end and leave lots of time to do so. So we all believe the solution to the challenges of a transition economy lie in that better skilled workforce, but the question is, how do we do it? So how do we create that positive vision? How do we get policymakers and employers to invest in skills? How do we ensure that the opportunities for learning are open to everyone, particularly those furthest from learning? And so ultimately the question is, how do we get more adults learning? So our VocTech challenge and our focus for the week of VocTech has been to get adults learning. So I'm going to come to you, Torsten, to ask you kind of the big question. What's the problem we're trying to solve? Why is it a systems issue? Why does it matter for all of us? Why should we all care about getting more adults learning?
Because we need convincing. I suspect the audience basically agrees with that statement anyway. But I mean, look, what are the big things we want to hold on to? One of them, I like the euphemism of growth being erratic. Growth being terrible. Absolutely terrible for the last 50 years. It's not just that it's been low. Productivity growth is 0.4% on average over the last 15 years. That's half it. And everyone's had a bad 15 years, right? They're more or less. But that's half the rate of the rest of the OECD over that phase. What does that mean for the public who don't normally wander the streets talking about productivity unless they're very sad or directly in the middle of Westminster? It means £10,700 lower wages than they would have been had they kept growing at the rate they were. And if you want to know why we can't cope with the energy crisis that goes up with bills going up by £1,000, food bills up by £1,000, your wages not having grown basically since 2008 is pretty high up the list of why we're in a terrible situation. So, and a large part of that is about capital broadly defined, human capital, public capital, business capital, all of them. All of our productivity gap with France is basically explained by the gap in capital. So investing in that capital as part of trying to get out of that stagnation we found ourselves in for 15 years should be blindingly obvious, but it's not what we are doing. Human capital is a large part of that. Then there's the inequality part of the picture. So that's a levels thing. Right? Everyone's had a pretty tough time for those 15 years. The inequality problem is that our education system in particular is not that it's terrible. Actually, by most international standards, our school leaving standards at 16 and our higher education system are good, strong systems, but it is very unequal. We have a third of our 18-year-olds not in education at all. That compares to about a fifth in France and Germany. So far fewer 18-year-olds doing anything useful. And so if those people are then flowing into the workforce and we haven't created a system that does have the potential for people to train in adult life, then what we're basically saying is there are no second chances. And actually, lack of second chances is pretty high up the list of problems facing Britain from an inequality perspective. So for both those reasons, we'd like some wage rises at some point, and nobody thinks Britain is as equal as it should be, I hope. Anyone's brave enough to say they do. We'll hear from them later. I'll take you to a food bank. But that is why we should care, big picture.
I think it's a really interesting point about the education system measuring up in terms of the metrics, and that then takes you to that question, well, are they the right metrics, and is it the right, if we're achieving everything we need to through the education system.
Well, we're achieving it on average.
But I mean, as in, if we're on average achieving it,
yeah,
but we're still not getting what we need at the other end of it, then that isn't a thing that you should be measuring. But we'll come back to that. And I know from your perspective, Stephen, that you're not going to say anything that challenges it, but you've also got in terms of the importance of learning. But I know you've got a really granular insight from the adult participation in learning survey and all the work that you do. I think there's a really particular challenge around skills for work that came through from that data.
Yeah, I think Torsten's list is compelling enough, but if that's not enough for you, we also know that learning's really good for health and well-being, for civic engagement, for a whole bunch of other stuff as well. We looked at community integration, for example, and how learning English can help with that. So I was very excited that we had a graph that shows how many more friends you have if you take part in learning. This may explain why I have fewer friends. I was excited by that graph. But
how many friends do we get?
Surprisingly, I think it's 2.6. I'm not sure how the
What, per training? We're all going to get a lot of friends.
We'll circulate the report afterwards, and you can weigh up how much you value those extra friends. But I've become waylaid. So there's kind of health and well-being and wider civic engagement reasons why this matters. And if you've got an ageing population and health pressures and a whole bunch of other stuff, well, this is another set of good reasons why we want more adults to be in learning. And that's why we're really pleased to be working with UFI on this and to be having this conversation during the week of VocTech. I think the thing that I would add is we've been tracking the number of adults taking part in learning for just over 30 years or so. And for most of the last decade, the press release was really easy to write because it was, participation's at another record low. We need to reverse some of the cuts that we've seen to budgets. And it's got a bit more difficult since the pandemic because more adults are taking part in learning since the pandemic, and that's been sustained. But it's really a growth in self-directed and online learning and learning for personal reasons, which has all those benefits that I talked about for health and well-being, potentially for careers and for other stuff as well. But you need those more formal routes as well. People are constrained at the moment by the fact that the adult skills budget is £1 billion lower in England than it was in 2010. That's 22% lower. And employers are investing about 20% less in training per person than they were back in 2010 as well. So we've got an interest in learning amongst lots of people, but their choices are constrained by the context that Torsten talked about and by where we are with public policy and employer practice, and that drives lots of inequalities that we can talk about as well.
I think that's really, really key, isn't it? That kind of the issue of what does learning look like? How do people access it? And is there something that we're seeing where we're actually disincentivizing people to engage with learning by the very system that's meant to encourage it? And I think that we know through our collective work and for us the more targeted focus of the VocTech Challenge that there's that growing disconnect between the skills we need for the transitioning economy, the skills that can address the green sectors, changing energy landscapes and the changing digital space, and the kind of what we're actually seeing in terms of the economic and societal need and how the system currently looks. And I think both of you have made really important points about the kind of the inequality and also the system. But there's a question there about how should we be thinking about a system in terms of supporting that specific change and transition?
That's a big question.
It is a big question.
So here's some, and I definitely don't feel qualified to answer all of that, but just here's some reflections into it. So one is, I think there's some dangers in this debate. So let's do the green transition for a second. So in that space, the thing I read all the time is people saying to me, people think about it as a transition from job A, usually like extracting oil from the ground, to job B, usually a wind turbine. Okay. Now, some of that may happen, and if I was in Aberdeen, I would be talking more about that. But for the economy as a whole, that is a very small part of what the transition actually means. For most people, what we actually mean is your job will change a bit. That's actually on bulk. There's some exceptions, again, so like big exception where there are actually volumes of people that we would care about would be mechanics. So car mechanics is definitely not, it's a bigger deal, probably does mean fewer car mechanics if we ever work out how to fix the Teslas, which hopefully we will at some point. Otherwise people will stop buying them. Although given that Elon Musk appears to be a bit of a fascist, there's upsides to that. But you can edit that out. It's got a lot of lawyers. A bit of a fascist, I said. Allegedly. Now, I've lost my train of thought. Right, my point was, so the danger is, I read a lot of reports saying there's a net zero transition going on. The skills piece of that is a retraining piece for people exiting one kind of work and going into another kind of work. And that worries me. That is important, but that's the thing that everybody focuses on. And my view is that is, one, quantitatively not where the action is. It's not the biggest part of the piece. It's important, but it's a small. Secondly, and this is like too much civil servant cynicism, but we're not very good at it. So like policy interventions for offering people later in life total retraining from one career to another, the evaluations are not great, if we're honest with ourselves. And they're definitely not great enough for me to be like, right, I should invest all the resources in that rather than in the wider, how do existing companies with existing employees do a good job of keeping their existing workforce to move to the new world. So that's my first framing. I would focus more on the existing jobs and the existing workforce and less on thinking about it as a total systems change. And then stepping back to some of our other things, I would say we need to integrate how we think about training into more broadly what we think about economic policy, what it's doing generally. Okay, so a large part of what economic policy should be doing is trying to make sure a large amount of the population have good work, however we define that, right? You've raised the care sector, big growing sector. Actually, a sector that should be growing because the need for it is growing. Actually, if you look at numbers working in social care, for example, it's not growing. Why is it not growing? Budget constraints. Right? But if we're actually, and that whole sector is a disaster, right, for that reason. But there, we do need to integrate a wider plan for the social care workforce, which is lifelong, in how people change what they do quite often. And the care sector is really interesting. There's a lot of change between the jobs people do, but they don't exit the sector very often. They change what they're doing, which companies they work for within the sector. So there is quite a lot of space. Again, I would be focusing on integrated within the wider question, which is basically how do we fund the social care sector, needs to be how do you make sure that you're providing that training that means you are sure you're providing good jobs. Because the reason those jobs are important is because they exist everywhere. Like certain kind of jobs will only ever exist in certain, like tradable services jobs generally will be concentrated in large cities. And we can pretend to ourselves that we're going to spread them out everywhere, but we won't. There's big economic drivers of why that's the case. But lots of really important jobs do exist in every single community. Care is a really good example. You've got to make those good jobs.
You're absolutely right. But I also think there's a sort of naivety in an argument that says, oh, we don't know what jobs there are going to be in 25 years. Do. Because 25 years ago, we didn't know what jobs there were going to be. And I think in lots of ways...
Well, and sometimes we do know.
Yeah.
We're definitely going to need a lot of care workers.
Well, when I left... So this is an anecdote, but when I was going through careers guidance at school, one of the only bits of careers guidance was, I remember someone standing at the front, a hall full of girls, because I went to girls' school, and said, you don't need to worry about what your job's going to be because they're going to need more nurses than there are girls leaving school, which was both inspirational and...
I think I got told to be a fish farmer.
I was also... It's working out.
I don't know why. Was there like... There used to be like, you used to tick boxes on some kind of automated... Is I making this up? I'm pretty sure it told me to be a fish farmer.
Yeah,
there's still time. There's a course.
There is time. That's reassuring, Stephen. Thank you for the advice. Not very good with fish.
Well, I might move us away from fish, but focus on the idea of kind of career change and transitioning. And actually, there's an argument that says one of the things that confidence can give people is the opportunity to make those transitions and to kind of make small changes that lead to big shifts in direction. And I say that as a geneticist sitting between two economists talking about skills. And that, for me, is one of the reasons it's so important that we think about what the system actually looks like and how it is working for people who haven't got that kind of confidence and privilege and opportunity. And I think we talked a lot about flexibility, didn't we, during the VocTech Challenge? I was going to ask you what your thoughts on that kind of that systems piece and how it matches with formal qualifications versus flexibility, really.
Yeah, so our research and surveys show that consistently the biggest reasons adults give for not taking part in learning is that they're not interested or can't see why they should. So that's kind of point number one. So you kind of need to get people interested and to have the right offer that makes them interested and for people to see the link through to whatever goal it is that they want to achieve. The second reasons or set of reasons that they give is that it's going to cost a bunch of money and they haven't got the time. So that kind of says we need to deal with that as well. And I think we sometimes take a sort of if we build it they will come approach, and then we're surprised when they don't. And the confidence thing is part of several of those elements, I think, as well. And it's kind of confidence and inspiration. And too often, I think, policy doesn't focus on the actual reasons why people aren't learning and why they say they're not taking part in learning. It's much easier to announce a new curriculum or a reform or a new entitlement to something than to think about this systems change. And that's why I think it's really important to take that systems view. That two of the key issues, I haven't got long enough to go through all the issues with skills policy in England because people have got homes to go to. But I think two of the really key reasons are, number one, you're 3 times more likely to get training at work if you've already got a degree level qualification than if you haven't. So we need to tackle that, and yet policy increasingly reinforces that by saying, well, we need an employer-led system, employers should do whatever they want, and then we're surprised when they do what they've always done. The purpose of public policy, in part, is meant to be to influence those choices so that we get socially optimal outcomes and everyone gets some chances in life. The second thing is that if you name almost any 3 letters in the alphabet, it either has been, currently is, or shortly will be a skills policy or institution. Don't throw Zs at me, but almost any 3 letters. And this constant chop and change, and let's announce a new thing, and then let's get rid of that, doesn't help that systems change that we need to think about and those motivations that we need to engage with.
You're absolutely right, but I think you've picked up a couple of pieces in there that we've sort of started touching on. That if we need this to change and we need it to be better, where does that responsibility lie? Who's doing this? Are we saying that actually government should do everything and it should all change, or should we be looking at this from a really different perspective and saying actually there's a system here that's not working?
So let's do there's the nasty bit first of all, which is the state isn't going to be doing loads more in the near-ish future, because if you step back to the big picture of what's going on, we have got reasonably significant fiscal pressures coming from, one, we'd like to undo some of the worst of austerity, 2, debt interest is up by about 2% of GDP, maybe we'll get lucky that will disappear again, but you can't build your economic strategy on 2% of GDP turning up. So there's not loads of happy days, plus we need to fund the net zero transition. Large chunks of that requires public investment, i.e. we're going to be paying people's heat pumps. So insofar as the state is going to be getting bigger, it's not going to be in this area in the foreseeable future. We can keep asking for it. On the margins, you can hope that we won't be seeing large, significant retrenchments, but the idea that there's the state is riding to the rescue in the short term would be an optimistic take on where we are. Plus history tells you that if there is any more money, it may well be that the HE sector is pretty good at lobbying for it, just historically. Now, where does that take you? It takes you, so that's bad news. Second bad news is that basically British companies don't want to do it. They particularly don't want to do it, because even though it's true that the better educated and the higher paid are much more likely to have had some training, the falls amongst the higher educated and the higher paid in training are very large. in fact, all of the falls are basically amongst them. They're still above lower earners, but this century we're talking big falls in the trading for those on higher pay. Secondly, firms I'm obviously simplifying here, but I think if you looked at the data rather than talking to anybody and what they said about what they were doing for their business, then you would basically conclude that British business doesn't want to employ, talk to, or meet a young person, basically. If I look at the apprenticeship numbers, if I look at the employment numbers, if I look at the training figures, they don't. They like, and if I, and then if I do let myself admit to what happens when I actually talk to the businesses, they all say to me, well, the youth of today, they come in here, they can't do the X and Y yet, they're not work ready, to which I always say, do you think they were work ready in 1920? This is just like how society works. Like most of us are not ready at some point, and then at some point we get ready by someone making us ready. But broadly, it's quite, I think, so where did that take you? Because that's a bit depressing. It basically, I'm afraid, does take you to versions of policy funded via companies, but with policy not being totally, which is why I know this is unfashionable, but I'm not all for complete flexibility about how the apprenticeship levy is used, all this stuff, because I know exactly how it will be used, and it won't be delivering any of the outcomes we want, and I promise you none of it will be used for any young people. I'm afraid I'm for the even more illiberal position, like ring fence a load of this money for young people, for in-firm trading. I wouldn't quite go to only young people having apprenticeships within firms, but I'd get pretty close to that position. So you are going to have to decide. Now, I think that's where we're heading, because the force is driving us there. I mean, the other routes aren't massively available. There's some big problems with that, obviously. One is how much and all the rest of businesses saying, I don't want to pay for that. The second is that the self-employed are a big problem in that world. So the self-employed in Britain are a large part of our workforce, not actually because technology makes that happen, despite what all the hippies say. It's just because the tax system massively encourages a large self-employed population in the UK, and it's not going away anytime soon. They don't get any training, and they definitely, and an employer-funded route doesn't offer much to that part of your population. So you definitely want to worry. I'm not worried about the really rich 55-year-old, 60-year-old IT and accountant workers who are all self-employed, who are just minting it from the tax system being ridiculous. But you would worry about the 25, 30-year-olds who are self-employed.
It's interesting. I think there's a lot of debate to have around that kind of that sort of systems piece. What are your views, Steve?
Well, the other sort of so I agree. I'd love to think there's going to be another £1 billion to restore the cuts to the adult skills budget in England anytime soon, but it feels unlikely, if I can put it that way. I think Torsten's correct. So then you get into the sort of can you get employers to do more, and what's the more? And you also get into how do we get the most out of the system that we've got? Because at the moment, I think there's short-term packets of funding, there's acronyms everywhere, and lack of joined up between a whole bunch of stuff. So we could get more out of it. I think the other point, so it comes back to Torsten's first point a little bit, I think, in that employers don't invest in training just for the will of it. They don't just think, oh, do you know what, let's do some training. It was related to their business strategy, and in a world of no growth, you don't invest in capital or people. So getting the economy going is a slightly trite recommendation. Good news is Torsten's got a much better, more detailed plan coming up to do some of that. But you have to link these things together. Otherwise, what happens with training levies in general around the world is that one of three things happens. Either employers just pay it and say, oh, it's a tax, I'm not getting that back. We don't want that. Or they pay it and they do more training, but just to get their money back, and they don't change anything they're doing or link it on, so there's no productivity improvement, and we don't want that. Or the third place is, well, they think, well, how can this help our business strategy? How can we do things differently? And that's the thing that we want. But at the moment, it feels like we're just pushing on a bit of string and just doing the skills thing, and we're setting up a levy and then there's a system around it, but it's not linked into that wider plan for growth or how industries are set up, and that's the systems thinking.
Yeah, and I think I think that question of why is the most important one that hasn't been asked. Why are we doing all of this? And then that idea about, well, what's the economic growth plan? Therefore, what's the system we need to deliver that economic growth plan? And then that starts taking you to a place of actually, okay, well, how do we provide those skills, and how do the mechanisms need to work in order to deliver what we're looking for. And then I agree with you, it kind of plays to that. It's not just about a kind of an incentive here or a levy there, but actually some joined up thinking that says, if we're going to put a levy here, what's the framework that sits around it that makes sure it delivers those economic and social outcomes that we need. And very much from our perspective, obviously we see technology being important in that, but also that kind of that really thoughtful agenda about what does this mean in terms of inclusion and opening up opportunity, because you don't win the economic debate if you don't make it right for everyone. I'm really conscious of time, and I know that there's lots of questions that people will want to ask. So if you're both open to it, I suggest we open it up to the floor and the floor and the wider world for any questions. So what I will say is, if you're going to ask a question, there is a microphone, and because obviously we're live streaming, please don't start asking it until you've got the mic, otherwise the people outside the room won't hear you. I'll go to a question over here. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Claire, and I sit at the intersection of a lot of different things. I'm an independent filmmaker, I'm an educator, I'm a creative technologist, I'm a passionate lifelong learner, and a passionate lifelong educator. I graduated as a criminologist in Australia before I became a filmmaker here. And I came to the education system here, and I find that a lot of the time we're talking about benefiting the young people. Yes, that is a real big priority, but there is a huge number of people who are over 40 who are stuck in careers that they can't get out of. And it seemed to me that the apprenticeship system was a way for people to be supported to change careers. And I think that's been ignored. We're based in Bournemouth. There are 2 big universities in Bournemouth. I teach at the real one, the Arts University, and I teach film. Film is the 3rd biggest contributor to GDP, and it's a very underskilled industry, moving into a very high-skilled environment very soon with virtual production. And so one of the things that we're very concerned about, we've got a lot of people who want to go into film who are going to end up in very low-skilled jobs that are about to be eradicated in the next 5 years because virtual production is going to get rid of many of the manual jobs. Also in Bournemouth, we have a lot of retirees who lost their work and their businesses through COVID period of time. So we've got a lot of people who are now on the verge of homelessness. There's no accommodation there because it's all been saved for Airbnbs and the seasonal move to the beach. So there's a real important thing about thinking about how we not just focus on the younger people who clearly do need help to navigate this world, but also acknowledging the point that people don't have to be stuck in a career for a period of time, and that there's a need for adult skill training to allow people who are coming back into the workforce after a period out of the workforce to catch up. And this is something I had to do in Australia when we had the first great technological revolution in 1983. The second great was teaching people who'd been out of the workforce initially how to do keyboard skills, very basic skills. So I'm just curious about why you said that the apprenticeship, you would ring fence them and not think about the policy for more people who are impoverished, who don't have the time left to put their money together for retirement.
I think it's a really interesting question, and actually, I think I'm slightly further down the view from you, which is I feel like it should be a tapered system, but I do think having targets for young people is a critical thing. But I'm really interested in the kind of rationale behind your ring fence as well.
Oh, sorry, you want me to answer the question? I thought this was the listing bit of the
Sorry.
So one, obviously everything you said is basically right on what we'd like to happen. I think I would be a little bit harder-headed, tough on ourselves on, is that what apprenticeships, which are increasingly being used for older workers, are doing? My answer would be basically no, they're not doing that. What they're being used for is firms with existing employers doing their existing jobs, being put on apprenticeship. That's what's happening. No one is transitioning into film at 55 on an apprenticeship today, like in Britain. That's not, and the numbers are tiny. So the system isn't doing that. And I think it's unlike the nature of our apprenticeship system and how we're currently doing it. I think it's unlikely to offer an easy route without quite large change to older workers who are, particularly if you're talking about really hard to reach. If you're really talking about people who we spend most of our time focusing on, which is people who are really at the harder end of the market, then the apprenticeship system is not going to work for that, because your prior problem is that employers are not interested in bringing those people in the door. So my issue is more to do with what do we want? It's back to your very first question. What are we actually trying to achieve? Okay, and in Britain, and then we've got to rank our problems, right? Because we're all going to have a long list of things that don't work in modern Britain, like the trains. Okay, but in this space, the biggest problem is that Britain basically provides very clear, high-quality routes for a large chunk of the population through schools, to their A-levels, and into university, and then into a desk, right? They're clear. Like, if I do an event, you know, I will never forget, I was in Newcastle, this is quite a long time ago, doing an event, and it was on this kind of topic, and at the end of it, these two mothers came up to me about their kids, and they were very, very distressed. And the reason they were distressed is because they could see that basically if their kids did GCSEs, A-levels, university, the desk, right, they would know now, to their 14-year-old, they could explain to them what Britain had to offer, right? The desk is not the most attractive thing, but the desk could be making films, okay? If you weren't going to follow that route, Britain is a disaster, right? It's a disaster. You cannot say to someone, this is the offer. This is the path from education into a decent job. And my view is that is a grade 1 problem. It's a huge problem. There are then really important problems, which is can enough 55-year-olds transition between careers? That is a big problem, but it's way smaller than the first problem. And I promise you, having met the British government, it cannot deal with all problems at once, because it often can't deal with any of them. So you're asking me and so that's what you've got to prioritise what you want. So so what you're saying is really important. 2, the apprenticeship levy is not being used to do what you want for older workers today. It's being used for existing workers in existing firms. They are not transitioning between careers. And 3, rank your problems. The biggest problem in Britain is that we basically say to a very large chunk of our younger population, we're not going to even try and give you a decent route on and up. And that is what a national disaster looks like.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything?
Well, the thing I would add is that the need for people to update their skills or retrain is going to increase with an ageing population and a decreasing supply over time of young people. And I think there are more simple things that we can do that should be within our remits to be able to do as a country to de-risk this a little bit. I feel like I'm not sure, I think the apprenticeship system is definitely not focused on retrainers at the moment, and I think there is a big problem with it effectively being a shoehorned in training scheme that there's more to life than apprenticeships. Feels a bit heretical to say these days, but I think one of the issues is for people looking to retrain or switch careers or something, it's a massive risk, whether you're 55 or 40 or 35 actually. You know, if you've got housing costs, if you've got dependents, or whatever it happens to be, we'll build up commitments over time, and it's difficult to take that big drop in living standards unless, you know, you're a billionaire, for example, or have wealthy family. So I think there are some things that you can do to limit the risk of that. So, for example, there's a rule called Train and Progress in Universal Credits that allows you to train for up to 16 weeks and keep your benefit if the job centre agrees. Well, that could be a year, couldn't it? It's not going to be like gazillions of people, but it would be some. So I think you can do some things to reduce the risk. I've got a list of other things, by the way. It's never going to be number one. It's not going to be the thing that transforms the economy, but I think there is some stuff you can do to make things better.
I think, I'll come to you in a second, Paul. I think I agree. And also, it comes back to that bigger. If you did it from a bigger umbrella of what you were actually trying to achieve, then it would be much more simple to kind of work out the different sort of tools you wanted to use to achieve it.
Yeah.
Paul, so we need a mic. There we are. Thank you.
Thanks. Paul McKean from JISC. I'm just kind of picking up the 2 points from Torsten and from Stephen. So just about the kind of displacement point there. It isn't that many jobs that are going to be displaced, but lots of jobs are going to be augmented. The trouble is people don't know what augmentation means. And actually they're scared of technology. They're not aware of how it can benefit them. And therefore they're unsure of what skills they do need in order to be able to augment, if you like. And you know, picking up your point, Stephen, about intrinsic motivation being the thing that people need in order to want to train, if they are aware of let's say the modular bit of training they need in order to augment their role, surely that has got to give people, more of an opportunity, because it isn't necessarily a 16-week or a 2-year course. It's certainly not a HE, 3-year degree programme. And that's the way that the economy's changing. And surely if it's almost like incremental gains, if everybody can get just a little bit better at their job, productivity will go up. So it's not about displacing the whole sector, it's about changing everybody's job. Just your thoughts.
Just add something to that, because I agree. I think there's I spoke to a taxi driver a few years ago who, when he found out what I did, I kind of got his views about lifelong learning. And he was kind of, first thing he said was, oh, well, my job's going to be automated cars, isn't it? But I'll be long retired by then. It's not an issue for me. And the second thing he said is he had an app on his phone where he was kind of doing various courses while he was waiting in taxi ranks. And he just did things he was interested in. He said he got to the end and they tried to make him pay for a certificate, but he wasn't doing that. And I did think that's the entire business model gone now, but I didn't say that. But so I think there are several different things. So the first is people's intrinsic motivation and what they like doing and enjoying doing, and there are benefits to that. There's a question about who pays for that, and at the moment it is individuals. That probably feels about right, though there is social prescribing for health and well-being, for example. And then the second thing is how people's jobs are changing, which is the more of the point you were making. Now, some of that is employers' responsibility that too many employers are not living up to. That's why the investment in trading has gone down so much, and we need to change that. But it's also like the confidence point that we were talking about before. People's confidence, people being willing to do it, people being not wanting to say to their manager, oh, I'm not sure about this, got to learn more about that, because they think they're going to be on a performance review. So there's a general corporate culture, an organisational culture there that I think we can build on. But I think what the survey we've done does, the latest survey shows, is that lots of people are confident with using technology to do some of that learning, and they're kind of doing it themselves. The question is, how do we make sure we don't have that digital divide, so some groups are missing out? And second of all, how do we harness it so it's productivity improving and linked to people changing their jobs or how their jobs are done, for example?
I think that point about how we change what people are using technology for is a really interesting one, because it comes back to that question around, is the system moving enough to actually harness people's enthusiasm and confidence with tech?
Yeah.
So I'll go to you and then the gentleman behind.
I've got a question for Stephen.
Thank you very much.
He promised us friends from this training. But if it's all apps, this taxi driver did not make any mates on his app, did he?
He might have done. There could have been a...
Okay, I want to know the answer. Do we get 2.6 friends per app training session? Sorry.
That's all right. My name's Holly. I'm from Future.now, and we're a charity that focuses on the essential digital skills, in particular for working age adults. And it was just interesting, Stephen, what you were saying there about how people can use technology, because what the data shows is that 59% of us in the UK don't have the 20 basic digital skills. And they're things like, can you set your privacy settings on social media? Can you identify a secure site? Can you check your payslip online? So there's so many opportunities out there, and technology is such an enabler, but with nearly 60% of us not able to do that. And that's not just in disadvantaged groups. That's 50% of people who have a degree don't do all 20 tasks. Same as if you're in technology. 38% of people can't do those tasks. So I guess I'm just highlighting the fact that there's this, we call it the hidden middle. There's this assumption that if you've got a smartphone, you're probably okay, and there's so many opportunities out there, but we shouldn't forget that those basic skills also need focus and upskilling, and that's basically our raison d'etre at Future.now. So very interested to talk to you about some of the data you've got about motivations as well, to understand how you look into that.
And so there's 9 million, so I agree, and there's 9 million adults across England with low literacy or numeracy as well. So these are things like understanding the dosage instructions on an aspirin packet, not calculus from first principles. So and yet there's 63% fewer adults taking those courses in England since 2010. So that's a massive issue. Skills boot camps are part of the government's answer in England, and there's kind of a decent principle there, but I think it's something like 2/3 of Skills Bootcamp participants already had an A-level equivalent qualification. 15% had a postgraduate qualification. So there's an issue of what is the purpose of public policy? I think it's missing out a group. I haven't got an answer to Torsten's question. I'm going to really have to check that 2.6% figure, which has become a bigger thing than I anticipated. But my sort of link between the 2 points to try and get around answering it is that some of the best learning is not purely online. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's blended learning, and that's where depends if you think, I don't know how many online friends is equivalent to 2.6 real life friends. There's probably a ratio somewhere, but that's
100,000.
Well, so that's why the kind of blended learning and in-person stuff I think really matters. And when we did focus groups with adults who'd taken part in learning or not, and we tried to test out some things about what would persuade you. And as an economist, I really thought, you'll earn 12% more, or get whatever. Nobody cared about that. It was people like me doing it, and I'll make friends. It really matters. So that's a really important message, I think.
I think that it also raises a really important point that when we talk about technology, sometimes there's an assumption that it's either a purely kind of digital play or it's in person. Yeah. But the reality is technology has a huge role to help people, possibly in a kind of an entirely physical space, but actually that there's ways you can use tech that can really kind of help support people. And I think sometimes the debate gets so polarised, you actually miss the reality, which is that most of it's somewhere in the middle. The microphone is... So we'll go to some online questions after this one.
Thank you, Jim Knight from the House of Lords, and once a very long time ago an employment minister, and before that an education minister. And I guess my question around public policy and systemic change is, my sense is we've got a skills system that's overly geared around qualifications. We now have employers starting to hire on the basis of potential and what people can actually do, rather than what the qualifications say they can do. We have qualifications that struggle to be agile enough to keep up with the skills needs of the labour market. We have training that now has a guaranteed job at the end of it. We have people hiring basically by having people play games to see their potential. Should we have public policy that's now much more geared towards job outcomes than qualification outcomes?
I think that's a really interesting question. So I think I'll let everyone answer it.
Well, so there's a kind of point about the emergence of micro-credentials as well, and how you sort of accredit things a little bit differently. There is a sort of agility of the system point as well. So we did some pilots a few years ago, funded by the Department for Education, with some local areas where they got some extra funding to do training in sectors they thought were sort of important for them. And when they named their sectors, and then they looked at what was on offer in the area, and they thought, oh goodness, because actually sometimes they didn't have provision linked to that sector, or it was really outdated and the employers weren't engaging with it. So I recognise the sort of challenge. One of the things, so then sort of the Treasury gets very worried about, well, how do we make sure this public funding is being spent properly if we're not got qualifications through it? One of the things that we've worked on a little bit with the Local Government Association is this idea of giving a single pot to local areas and measuring the employment and earnings outcomes of people. This is based on a system in Canada where you can go online, you can see how Ontario's doing if you're... I have actually done that, that's sad. But that kind of focus on the outcomes, and then one of the challenges I would give to that though is how you have transferability, because you might get a job now, but how does the next employer know? Maybe they're going to do the sort of recruitment approach that you talk about, but again, that's a systems approach. How do we encourage more employers to do that? So I think I've always argued we should focus much more on outcomes. Maybe the micro-credentials, coupled with encouraging more employers to take the approach that you've described, would help that sort of transferability point.
I think there's a really interesting piece about where we are now in terms of the access we have to technology and systems, because I feel like for the last 20 years there's been this sort of kind of suggestion that there's been, and probably longer, but I've only been involved in the conversation for the last 20 years, disconnect between what employers want and what's coming out of people's degrees at universities. What's different about now is that we actually have the opportunity to do much more around that modularity and that kind of things like micro-credentials, but also kind of all of the different pieces of the system are much more open to being changed and developed in a way that can actually support employers and employment and people's kind of understanding of what's needed, there's an opportunity to be much more transparent about it through tech as well. But I'm not going to, I'll get off that soapbox and go over to you, Torsten.
So I've got a prior, because I'm not sure, Jim. That's the thing. When we say, so I know that some employers are using computer games to, but are we really, I mean, I'm not confident, I'm going to go and look, but are we really confident that credentialism is actually down amongst employers and practice that hugely? I'm not sure. Are we? Is everyone? Okay, well, I'm going to go and educate myself there and find out, because when I look at the data, I come away thinking, in lots of ways, if you haven't, like, what are we as a country? We're a country where if you don't get your English and maths at 16, you're in real trouble. Like, you're in real trouble. Does that match with a country where employers don't look at the qualifications? Not only they're looking at they're looking at 2 specific qualifications taken at one point in lives and making. I mean, if you look at the data, like, there's a really good study looking at what happens to kids that go 1 point over and get a decent pass for English and maths and come 1 point under. The effect is very large. Why is the effect very large? Because credentialism does exist. Now, some of that credentialism is within the system.
But Torsten, is also that you can't access any of the post-16.
Yes, that is.
You can't access any of the post-16 pathways without level 2 English and maths. That's a different problem.
The paper shows that as well, so I completely agree. So insofar as the state is definitely doing a lot of the credentialism, not the private sector. Indeed, so I'll go into. But I have a gut nervousness along the lines of Stephen's last point, which is I can see how training works. All right, I haven't said anything yet. I can see how that works with a current employer. I'm definitely a little nervous about leaving people with nothing to show for it, but that's because I'm an old-fashioned person, Jim.
But I think there's a middle ground between.
Phew.
Yeah, I think I agree with you about the kind of credential side of things, but I do think a lot of it's very policy-driven, and as Jim was saying, it gets reinforced by that need to keep retaking, and if you want to access any provision post-16. But actually, I think there's an argument that says not that we should abandon everything and do it all based on kind of work piece recruitment, but that there is another way through micro-credentialing, through looking at how you evidence skills in a much more kind of modular way, rather than looking for one single big qualification. And that's where the changes come. I'm conscious we've got some online questions, and I don't want to ignore those.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm trying to work out which one is, whether to go with what people have been talking about or go on to something very different. There's a question from Anonymous, an individual, I assume. How much regional variation in the skill system is necessary or desirable? System complexity creates many barriers. Does devolution make this better or worse?
Let's have a massive row.
Yeah. We'll sort that out in the next 2 minutes, if we could just, yeah.
Do we know that? That is a really big question. So my boring credentialist position is that I don't want regional qualifications, and the rest is when Andy Burnham never speaks to me again. But that's madness. You do actually have a labour market, and the labour market should ideally function. Now, I think there's on the regional divergence, I would actually come at this from a different perspective, which is you definitely don't want that on the qualification side. You will want it, obviously, in terms of the provision. I think there's a bigger question, which is, and this comes out from some work we did recently, which the work was actually about Birmingham and Manchester, but the research showed us lots about the whole country which basically says that the graduate premium is basically falling everywhere except for London, right? Everywhere now. So now, the reason that's important is because I don't want to get into the techie-ness of it, but I think we need to ask harder questions, not just, so like Birmingham, right? For Birmingham to be successful, it definitely needs more graduates, right? Birmingham is famously has low qualification levels, right? They're really low. But Birmingham can't use the graduates it's got now. Well, that's what that graduate premium is telling you, right? And that is about, and you can't fix that through the skill system. You've got to fix the economy. You've got to fix the ability to use the skills you've got. You've got to fix the public transport system, because in Birmingham, large numbers of the high qualified graduates can't get anywhere near the city centre where the high productivity work's going. Unless you fix that, you're not going to no firm's going to locate there, right? So there's that. So I think the regional angle brings out big differences in what the actual economic strategy is for different places, and those are, in the end, you want skills as a big part of those things, but you definitely need to be clear where it's the binding constraint and where it's not, and that is different across places.
I think there's a really interesting, and I don't know the answer to this, but that graduate premium piece, there's something about whether or not it's just a kind of amplification of a bigger problem in London, in fact, that actually is there such a low level of wage? Where does that premium come from?
Remember, this is so to put that more positively, a contributing factor. Like one, obviously, the long term, we want the graduate premium falling, right? We're aiming to educate more people. We're aiming to the further graduate premium. So that's per se not the problem. It's possible that contributing to the fall in the premium outside London is that the minimum wage bites more outside London, and we're pushing that up. Because this has been a bit grim, this conversation, right? But there's some things to celebrate, okay? So for the last 20 years, the lowest hourly paid workers have seen twice the wage rises of the typical. Right? We've been consistently giving the largest pay rises to the lowest earners, hourly earners, not weekly, hourly, over the course of the last 20 years. That could have contributed. To it, but that's not enough to be doing this. We definitely don't want that scale of divergence to continue. And also the other thing to step back and say is, if we thought that was all good news, we'd be, in the end, Birmingham's got very low productivity, right? So we know that that's aligned with graduates not able to earn a decent wage in Birmingham because the city's not able to provide enough high quality work that would lead to I don't want to sound like a kind of neoliberal, but we do actually need to make and sell something ideally expensively to the rest of the world at some point, and Birmingham's not doing enough of that.
I'm conscious that we're nearly at the end of our hour, so I think we may have to wrap up at this point. But so I'd like to just ask you both for kind of a final reflective thought, and take us out of Birmingham and up into the whole system.
Or the stratosphere.
Yeah.
maybe
UK would.
I think UK would. I think a bit of grounding in Birmingham would be a good idea. Like in general, I mean, I'm not going to go on about Birmingham too much, but like Britain stands out for its large cities being below average productivity. Right? Almost everywhere else in the world, the larger the city, the more productive. Britain is like, we've got to sort out the productivity of our large cities, and that is going to take a lot of work. And if you don't focus on that, these are, again, going back to Lily's question earlier, like we've got to focus on the big things we're going to actually fix. And that would be very high up my list of things you're going to fix. On Britain and the skills system, again, just to highlight, we've got to be clear about choices and which problems are the biggest. And I think we should take some of the good news that people are self-accessing, even if they don't get any friends for it, but people are accessing more training after the pandemic, and they're doing that via online. And we can even see that in actually the ventures that come forward to us at the Resolution Foundation, kindly supported by Ufi VocTech Trust, who are offering those kinds of services in large numbers. And obviously we're looking at the ones that are offering them to disadvantaged groups in particular, but you can definitely see that, often offering hybrid provision, as you say, as well. So I think that's good grounds for optimism. I would say we should keep that, hope that those things continue, and then we should be really tough on ourselves on, are we prioritising solving the big problems? And Britain's big problem is very high inequality of routes for young people, and you are not going to solve that once that person's had 30 years in the labour market. You've got to fix it early, and if you don't, good luck.
Thank you. Steve?
Well, so a couple of thoughts then. So one is that I could definitely name some tweaks I'd like to make to the skill system, but tweaks alone and to a skill system alone are not going to be enough. That's why I think the systems thinking is really important, and linking learning and skills into those local labour market and economic and national economic and labour market strategies as well, because skills policy, if you just do skills policy, it's like pushing on a bit of string. So you need the other, to overextend the analogy, you need the other bit of the string being pulled along as well, else you're not going to get anywhere. I feel like you've got more chance, you definitely need to do some of these things at national level, like apprenticeship standards and qualifications and some of the kind of things we're prioritising. But in terms of putting them together and what they look like in different areas of the country. And by country here, we're talking about England, but the same applies elsewhere across the UK, I'd say. I feel like you need to do more of that locally than people are able to at the moment. And I think last point is about the goals and objectives. So everybody's view about what's good or bad about the apprenticeship levy is driven by what they think it should be there for. And the government's never really set out what it thinks it's there for. Originally it was kind of to hit a 3 million apprenticeship start thing, but without to get it the budget down off the public spending totals. And then we kind of got rid of that. Now it's an employer-led system, but the goals are not clear, I think. And that's why I think starting from the goals, whether it's the outcomes we talked about or whether it's something else, then drives what you do rather than the other way around, which it's too often been, which leads to the, in fact, sorry, I'm pointing at this, no, there you go, systemic change. That's why it's systems. I knew it was there. That's why it's, we'll edit this bit out afterwards. That's why the systems change point, rather than just tweaking a few policies, is absolutely central.
Fantastic, and I think that's actually the perfect place to end, isn't it? Is it? Because I couldn't agree more. It's that big systems piece, and I think we have got to kind of grasp that overarching strategic intent and make sure we develop a system that is designed to deliver it, as opposed to tinkering around the bottom of it and putting little sticking plasters on. So on the big systems change piece, I will call our session to an end. Thank you everybody for engaging. Thank you everyone for joining us on the live stream. A particular thanks to Torsten and Stephen for really fantastic debate. And I feel like there's so much more we could cover, go on for hours. But we can't go on for hours because we've got a fantastic VocTech showcase lined up for the rest of the evening, which is going to be downstairs in the vaults, and we will also be announcing the winners of the VocTech Future of Skills Award. It's genuinely exciting. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the opportunity to talk more over a glass of something fizzy, probably water in my case, but and some lovely canapes, but most importantly, all of the organisations we support are here tonight. Some of them are demoing, they're all in the room. There's some fantastic people with some fantastic solutions who are going to contribute to some systemic change. So all it leaves is a round of applause, I think, for Stephen and Torsten.